Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, and we're headed straight into Week 12 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup and talk about every single player at the running back position and break down who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. Before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 12 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 12's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch on Underdog are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards this week's action and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code DCatch. That link is down below. Very quickly here, we have 6 teams on bye week in Week 12, the most so far on the season. No Atlanta Falcons, no New York Jets, no Buffalo Bills, no New Orleans Saints, no Cincinnati Bengals, and no Jacksonville Jaguars here in Week 12. So plenty of running backs on bye week here in Week 12. Make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We got the Steelers traveling to face the Browns. Let's start with the Steelers side of things with Najee Harris, who has had double-digit fantasy performances in every game since Week 6. Double digits in every game except for one since Week 3, and he barely missed the mark in that game at 9.7 fantasy points. So coming off of a 13.3 fantasy day and a tough matchup in Week 11 at home against the Baltimore Ravens, 18 touches on the ground, 63 total rushing yards, and added 4 receptions off of 5 targets for 30 receiving yards. I mean, Najee is just a solid start on a weekly basis. Another tough matchup here against the Browns. Strongest part of this defense is definitely against the run, but I mean, if he's going to get you 13-ish points against the Ravens, I don't see why we would be benching Najee Harris here in Week 12, especially with all the teams on bye weeks. So Najee, a good start this week, even on a short week. And Jaylen Warren came through 10.8 fantasy points in Week 11. Definitely not a player that I'm necessarily looking to start, but if you're in a tough position due to the bye weeks this week, I do think that he is a fine floor play. We just kind of have to look so far on the season. Week 11 was his first week with a double-digit fantasy performance. 9 touches, 41 total rushing yards, 4 targets, 4 catches, 27 total receiving yards, and like I said, 10.8 fantasy points. Outside of that, 9.5 or less in every other single game that he's played in so far on the season. So don't get me wrong, if you're absolutely desperate, he sits at 56% rostered. He'll probably get you some points, but I don't want to go out of my way to start Jaylen Warren on a short week. I kind of still have him in that handcuff territory. If you're desperate, don't get me wrong, he'll get you some points if the bye weeks are hurting you that badly. Now, looking at the Browns, last week we had a great matchup for Nick Chubb against the New Orleans Saints, who have struggled mightily against the running back position thus far on the season. And Nick Chubb, 5 points. I thought he'd be a decent kind of fill-in spot play, a guy that you could end up flexing last week, and that did not happen. This run game for the Browns is just not really existent, especially with Jameis Winston at the quarterback position. So Chubb having 11 carries for 50 yards just didn't do it for your fantasy lineup, and now he gets a tough matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I am staying away from Nick Chubb. You just have to be in a really desperate situation due to bye weeks here in Week 12 for me to say, okay, I guess he'll get you some points, but I don't feel comfortable starting Nick Chubb this week. Jerome Ford had a better fantasy day, 7.9 fantasy points. He got involved in the pass game where Nick Chubb had 0 targets. Ford had 4 targets for 4 receptions, 29 receiving yards, just 10 yards on the ground off of 5 carries. But I'm not in any way confident starting Jerome Ford if I'm not confident starting Nick Chubb. And then Pierre Strong, just 2 touches this past week. He's not even fantasy relevant, but the next man up here. I'm not starting any Browns running backs this week. Even if you're desperate due to bye weeks, I still want to avoid this backfield on a short week, even at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. Moving along to Sunday's action, we're going to have the Titans traveling to face the Texans in a divisional matchup. So, what can we expect out of Tony Pollard this week, coming off of his worst fantasy performance so far on the season with 4.9 fantasy points against the Minnesota Vikings in Week 11? Well, I think he's still startable. The Texans have been pretty good against the run for majority of the season. They rank top 10 in the fewest fantasy points allowed to the position. And I am recording this before Monday Night Football, but I don't think that Monday Night Football is really going to change that ranking against the Cowboys. Nonetheless, we knew it was a tough matchup for Pollard going into Week 11 against the Vikings. He had 15 yards on the ground, 2 catches for 14 receiving yards. Just 4.9 fantasy points, like I said. He's still startable here. He's still a top 25 running back thus far on the season. But I would really only start Tony Pollard if you're left with no better option. In an interesting fashion, the Titans have become a little bit more efficient throwing the football with Will Levis in the past 2 weeks, where we had got pretty comfortable to them not being efficient throwing the football. So we'll see what happens here, but I really don't want to start Tony Pollard unless I'm just left with nothing better. Like I said, he's startable, but what is the real upside that we're going to get out of Tony Pollard this week? I'm not quite sure. Now, Tajay Spears, should have an asterisk next to his name, confirmed to have a concussion in Week 11 against the Vikings. He may or may not play this week. He just can't seem to stay healthy. He's not going to be an option for us, even if he is able to suit up and pass his concussion protocol. I don't feel any confidence there. And then Julius Chestnut would be the next man up if Tajay misses this week, or maybe he gets touches even if Tajay's cleared. I don't know, but the only running back that I would consider starting on the Titans this week is going to be Tony Pollard. On the other hand, we got Joe Mixon in a great matchup against the Tennessee Titans this week. This defense has fallen back in terms of their rankings against the running back position. They're still decent, but certainly not as great as most of the teams out there, right? And once again, I am recording this before Monday Night Football, but I'm expecting a great game against the Cowboys for Joe Mixon, who's been absolutely fantastic since returning from that ankle injury he suffered in Week 2 on Sunday Night Football against the Bears. He's had 16.6 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 6. You're not benching Joe Mixon whatsoever. If something drastic happens in Monday Night Football, like an injury or whatever, there'll be a pinned comment down below. But if you own Mixon, he's healthy, you are starting him. Anybody else here, Damian Pierce, Dare Gunbowale, not going to be options. This is Joe Mixon's backfield. Great matchup at home here. Expect another big performance out of Joe Mixon in Week 12. Next up, we'll have the Vikings traveling to face the Bears, and let's talk about this Vikings backfield. A little bit of a quiet week in Week 11 for Aaron Jones, and a pretty good matchup against the Tennessee Titans. 39 yards on the ground, 1 catch for 4 receiving yards. Did have a fumble. That was not a lost fumble, but just 5.3 fantasy points. But we look back on the season, Aaron Jones has been great. He's had double digits every game this year except for 3. He's had 11.5 or more fantasy points every game since Week 7. It's a good enough matchup here against the Bears. We know he's going to be utilized in this matchup. Aaron Jones remains in the start category for me, but it is worth noting that we saw more involvement out of Cam Akers in both Weeks 10 and 11. In Week 11, 10 touches on the ground, 2 receptions off of 2 targets for 11 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, 11.6 fantasy points. I'm not ready to say start Cam Akers, and quite frankly, I don't think we're going to get to that point on the season unless something happens to Aaron Jones, but I will say Cam Akers, a good handcuff to have right now, as Ty Chandler saw just 1% of snaps this past week in Week 11, 14% of snaps in Week 10. Believe that Cam Akers is now the RB2 on this roster. I think we can say with confidence, Ty Chandler, just not somebody we need to consider from a fantasy perspective. Now, I told you guys going into last week, don't give up on DeAndre Swift. This is one bad game between weeks 4 and 10, and he bounced back in Week 11 against the Green Bay Packers. 71 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, 2 catches for 13 receiving yards, and a double-digit fantasy performance with 16.4 fantasy points. Now, I could see the Bears coming out this week and struggling a bit. This is a tough matchup against the Vikings. They are good against the run, but I'm going to leave Swift in starting lineups. feel like for most people out there with the bye weeks, you're probably not going to be in a position where you feel like you can bench Swift. So he's a good start this week. I continue to roll with him. Roschon Johnson, this is kind of a similar situation, right? Roschon Johnson, a good handcuff, but I'm still not ready to try and guess when we're going to get a good fantasy performance out of Roschon Johnson. If you guys remember early in the season, we did that a couple of times, some of those soft matchups, and it was just way too inconsistent. But this past week, 11.1 fantasy points. He did have a rushing touchdown, 10 touches, 33 yards on the ground, and a catch for 8 receiving yards, but it's just not enough here, not enough of a consistent pattern. Roschon Johnson, Cam Akers, we got some good handcuffs in this matchup. We also got 2 running backs that are studs that we want to start in DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones. And that's going to be the calls in this matchup for week 12. Moving along, we got another divisional matchup here. That's going to be the Cowboys traveling to face the Commanders. Once again, recording this before Monday Night Football. So if Monday Night Football results in injury or changes my perspective on things, there'll be a pinned comment down below. But I have said all week going into week 11, I do think Rico Dowdle is startable, but what's the ceiling here? Week 11 should be, a good indication of what we could potentially get in week 12. The coaching staff has come out and said they're rolling with Rico Dowdle. We're no longer doing this committee thing. I don't know why it took 10 weeks to figure that out, but obviously Ezekiel Elliott, Dalvin Cook, Deuce Vaughn, anybody else. I don't know why I keep putting Dalvin Cook's name on the screen. He's on the practice squad. He shouldn't even be on the screen, but we're giving Dalvin Cook a little bit of a shout out here. Any other Cowboys running back being the main point here, we're not starting, but Rico Dowdle, startable. Just don't quite know what type of ceiling we're going to get with Cooper Rush at quarterback and this team kind of in shambles here, but he is startable if he does not suffer an injury on Monday Night Football. Startable, but only if you're desperate due to the bye weeks. And if he has a monster game against the Texans, then we can talk about it in the comments down below. All right, the Commanders, on the other hand, we are starting Brian Robinson Jr. in a fantastic matchup against the Cowboys here in Week 12, coming off of a performance in a tough matchup against the Eagles in Week 11, where he had 14.2 fantasy points, 63 yards on the ground, a touchdown and 1 catch for 9 receiving yards. I know before week 11, we had kind of the bad outing against the Bears, and then he missed 2 games. So we were kind of like in maybe a different mindset about Brian Robinson Jr. But as long as he's healthy, especially in good matchups, we're going to continue to start Brian Robinson Jr. He is a strong start this week. And Austin Eckler continues to be a strong start as well. 17.3 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. Obviously, Brian Robinson Jr. out for 2 of those games, but this past week, with that stat line that we just talked about that Brian Robinson Jr. had, Eckler still came through with 17.6 fantasy points, just 2 carries, but he had 9 targets, 8 catches, 89 receiving yards, and in total, just got super involved in the passing game. The game script did benefit him there. Don't know if this game script's going to benefit him, but still, he's a good start. He's done enough on the season that he can be considered in the start category. And what we do know about this offense is the pecking order basically goes Terry McLaurin, Zach Ertz, and then however Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler are going to be involved, and they might even be before Zach Ertz on that pecking order. There's really nobody else who's stepped up on a consistent basis in terms of pass catchers or offensive utilization on this team. We've even seen the rushing upside from Jaden Daniels really come down in the past couple of weeks. So there's enough volume for Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler on a weekly basis until further notice. Next man up would be Jeremy McNichols. Not considering him. Chris Rodriguez back to the practice squad. So we're starting B-Rob, starting Eckler, and Dowdle if you're desperate here in Week 12. And I'm expecting a big performance out of Brian Robinson Jr. in this matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. I love his line on Underdog right now, sitting at 61.5 total rushing yards. He has hit that line in each of his last 3 starts, and we know that he's got a chance to absolutely decimate this Dallas Cowboys run defense. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Brian Robinson's total rushing yards, and don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch are getting that free NFL Pick 'em for the week. Take your free pick 'em, pair it with Brian Robinson Jr.'s total rushing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up on Underdog with promo code DCatch, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Next up, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Dolphins, another divisional matchup. And let's start things off here with Ramondre Stevenson and the Patriots side of things. So, Ramondre has been very solid over the past 4 weeks. Overall in the season, he's the RB20, not the RB12, but 12.9 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups. And how I kind of feel about Ramondre is he's always startable. It's just kind of hard to guess when he's going to have these higher ceiling games, lower ceiling games. Difficult to call, especially with Drake May at quarterback and the passing game being better. What we do know about this Miami Dolphins defense is they are better against the pass than they are against the run. So this could be a good week for Ramondre Stevenson. I think he's very startable. I like him more than some of the other players that we've had in this type category throughout the video, but it's just difficult to call exactly in total what we're going to get out of the Patriots offense on a weekly basis, then B, what we're going to get out of Ramondre on a weekly basis. We haven't seen him score a touchdown since week 9, but he had 2 touchdowns in week 8, 2 in week 9, 0 in week 10, 0 in week 11, but this past week was a little bit more involved in the passing game, which helped bump him up to that 12.9 fantasy stat line. So listen, if you own Stevenson, don't panic. I don't think he's like an awful start or anything. Just not one of my favorite starts because I think his upside gets a little bit capped with Drake May at the quarterback position here and this team starting to open up the passing game, but that doesn't mean that he's a bad start. It's just kind of difficult to call when is he actually going to have these games where he's catching more passes or getting into the end zone. But he's fine to start this week. Antonio Gibson, nothing but a handcuff. Hasn't had more than 3 fantasy points since week 6 of the season. We're staying away from that situation. Then we got Devon Achane looking at the Miami Dolphins, who's going to be a solid start. 10.5 or more fantasy points in every game since week 7, coming off of a great fantasy performance in week 11 against the Las Vegas Raiders. 20.5 fantasy points, 73 yards on the ground, a tutty, 4 catches for 32 receiving yards. And right now, there's just really no threat on this roster to that volume. Jalen Wright, 5 touches on the ground, a target, a catch. This past week, Raheem Mostert, a little bit banged up and basically invisible in that matchup in week 11 against the Raiders. 3 touches for -2 yards. He might not even play here in week 12. So it's Devon Achane or nobody else here, and he is obviously a very strong start as we move into week 12. And one line that I absolutely love on Underdog this week is Devon Achane's total rushing yards, currently sitting at 65.5 rushing yards. He has hit that in every game except for 2 since week 7. So that's in 3 of his last 5 matchups, and he barely missed it in week 9. We know he's the lead back here. We know Raheem Mostert has a chance to miss week 12. The Patriots have not been great against the run, so I would be heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Achane's total rushing yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code DCatch are getting that free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 12's action. Take your free pick'em, pair it with Achane's over on the rushing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up with promo code DCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, next up we got the Kansas City Chiefs coming off of their first loss in the season, traveling to face the underdog Carolina Panthers. So this is going to be an interesting one, and I can already see a lot of people's reaction to what I have up on the screen, but just kind of hear me out here. So I've got Kareem Hunt in the start category. I've got Isaiah Pacheco, who is expected to make his return here in week 12 from injury, and kind of the category. And my thought process here is that I think Kareem Hunt against this very weak Carolina Panthers run defense is going to end up getting potentially more touches then Isaiah Pacheco in his first game back, because I do believe in this soft of a matchup, they're going to want to ease Isaiah Pacheco in. I still think he's startable because of how good this matchup is, and I think he can have a respectable fantasy stat line with limited touches, but I also believe they're going to limit Pacheco's total touches in this first game back. I could be completely wrong on this one. We could see Hunt completely disappear. Nobody really knows what Andy Reid is thinking on a weekly basis. But what we do know is that both Hunt and Pacheco are going to see some sort of volume in this game, and there's a very realistic possibility that both players could walk away with double-digit fantasy stat lines against what is one of the worst run defenses in the entire NFL. So what I would really say is that I would just kind of caution yourself if you're going all in week 12 on Isaiah Pacheco and just expecting this monster game and Kareem Hunt to completely disappear. I just don't quite know that that's going to happen, especially with the fact that the Chiefs are primed to make the playoffs. I don't even know if there's a mathematical way that they won't make the playoffs this year, but at the end of the day, I think they want to keep Isaiah Pacheco as healthy as possible. And in a matchup like this, I could just see Kareem Hunt coming in and spelling Pacheco as they ease him back into the speed of things. Now, like I said, could be wrong, but I would call Kareem Hunt a strong start this week. And I would call Isaiah Pacheco a good start, but I think it might take a week or two for Pacheco to really take over this backfield again. And once again, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities that we continue to see a good amount of volume to Kareem Hunt to try and get Isaiah Pacheco carried over into the playoffs and when this team really starts to do more damage overall to the league. But we'll find out here. Other than that, Carson Steele, Samaje Perine just staying away, no consistency, nothing there. Now, let's talk about the Carolina Panthers because we have some interesting updates with this backfield as well. I'm starting Chuba Hubbard. I know it's not a great matchup here against the Kansas City Chiefs, but I'm going to continue to roll with Chuba Hubbard as a strong start. But we do know that according to Dave Canales, we're going to see Jonathan Brooks make his debut here in week 12. But we also kind of got that word that he was supposed to do that in week 10 against the Giants. So I don't know exactly what we're going to get out of Jonathan Brooks here in week 12. I don't know exactly how it's going to impact Chuba Hubbard, but I'm not too personally concerned about it. I think that Chuba Hubbard has played lights out. I mean, he's still the RB10 on the season. He's only given you single digits twice on the season. Really, since Bryce Young got benched initially, he's only had single digits once against a good Denver Broncos run defense. I mean, Chuba Hubbard's played lights out all season long. I still think he's easily the lead back here. It is a home matchup, so that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable about the bad matchup. I have confidence in Chuba Hubbard this week. I don't want to rely on Jonathan Brooks in my starting lineup this week because just because he's making his debut doesn't mean he's going to get a crazy amount of volume. He might have 5 touches. He might see 2 targets. We just don't know how this is going to look. But I do believe that Chuba Hubbard is still very startable and should be in your starting lineups. Then Miles Sanders, on the other hand, just not even fantasy relevant at this point in the season. So 2 backfields that are a little bit interesting here, but that's how I look at them going into week 12. All right, next up we have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Giants. We got both teams coming off of their bye week. Let's start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And for me, we're starting Bucky Irving. We're starting Rachaad White, especially with the bye weeks. I mean, there's just no reason to not start either of these players. A good enough matchup here against the Giants. In the past 4 starts, Bucky Irving double digits in 3 out of those 4 starts. Rachaad White 4 double-digit performances in his last 4 starts. Take that, all you Rachaad White haters. But anyways, yes, I'm a Rachaad White stan, if you guys don't know. I mean, both have been great. I mean, there's really just no reason not to start any or either of these players. Now, if Mike Evans returns this week as he's expected to, you might be saying, well, maybe there's less volume now. We don't need to see as involvement out of Rachaad White in the passing game. I think that is a fair argument. But really, I mean, I think that there's still enough volume here. It's not like we were seeing wide receivers really do much in the past couple weeks. I still think that there's enough for both backs to be productive going into the week. It's a good matchup. Irving, White with the bye weeks. I'm good starting both of these guys this week. I'm not worried about too much of anything to do with either player. Sean Tucker, 0 touches in week 10. Just haven't seen him do anything since that wild performance in week 6. So Sean Tucker still off the radar here. Irving and White are good starts this week. And I think Tyrone Tracy is a good start as well. It's a good enough matchup here against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They are better against the run than they are against the pass, but I'm still okay with this matchup. Now, we're getting Tommy DeVito at quarterback. I don't quite know how that's going to impact things. The Bucs secondary, not very good. They're not good against the pass, but I will say I would expect the Giants to rely on Tyrone Tracy and the run game a bit in this matchup. So I think the volume will be there. 15.4 fantasy points in week 10 against the Panthers. Tyrone Tracy, very startable, and I think with the bye weeks, once again, you own him. You're probably going to be in a position to start him. Devin Singletary, 5.5 or less fantasy points in his last 4 starts. Has not really been fantasy relevant since week 3 of the season, so not looking to start Devin Singletary in this matchup. But I do believe that Irving, White, and Tracy are all good starts here in week 12. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Colts, and we got 2 running backs on the Lions, both in the top 10 at the position thus far on the season. Let's start with David Montgomery, a player that I really encourage you guys to start all of last week. And I felt pretty good about this one because my prediction did come true. My prediction was 20 plus fantasy points for David Montgomery. Seen a little bit more volume from him and the potential to kind of close out that game. And I mean, they didn't really use him to close out the game. They just kind of kept racking up points the entire game, but he did have 2 touchdowns. Another thing that I said in Sunday morning's video I thought was a very realistic possibility. 75 yards on the ground, 3 catches off of 3 targets for 20 receiving yards, 24.5 fantasy points. I mean, Monty's been great. He's the RB8 on the season. No reason to sit him, even in tough matchups, but this isn't even particularly a tough matchup here in week 12 against the Colts. So start him. Gibbs is your RB4 on the season, 19.3 fantasy points in week 11, 69 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 1 catch for 54 receiving yards. We've seen double digits out of Gibbs every single week of the season. You're not benching Gibbs. We all know this. Let's move along. Now, Jonathan Taylor, this is a tough matchup. I do think if you own him, you're probably going to have to start him. You could consider other options because it's a tough matchup against the Lions. But the bigger issue, I would argue, as JT's done pretty well against good defenses for the most part in the season, is that Anthony Richardson's back at quarterback, and we saw him rush for 2 touchdowns in week 11. So now you're going to have Jonathan Taylor owners going, I don't know here. Am I going to see Anthony Richardson continue to vulture touchdowns? It might happen, but I just feel like with the bye weeks and everything going on, JT's still a pretty solid start. Going to be difficult to bench him. I mean, he still had 24 touches in week 11 and then 2 targets as well. So I know it was a disappointing stat line in week 7 against the Jets, who the Jets have not been good against a run on the season, but I still have a tough time benching Jonathan Taylor. I'm leaving him in starting lineups. If we get another concerning stat line in week 12, then maybe we can talk about it. Tyler Goodson, Trey Sermon, nothing here, nothing consistent. We're not looking to start either player, but JT, Monty, Gibbs, plenty of studs. Go ahead and fire them up here in week 12. All right, next up, we have the grossest matchup so far in today's video in terms of running backs. Taking a look at the Broncos traveling to face the Raiders. Let's start with the Broncos side of things, and I talked about this throughout last week. This is a Sean Payton backfield. Don't know if we can really trust this trend. We saw Audric Estime get 14 touches in week 10. That came down to 6 touches, 3 targets, 3 catches in week 11, just 5.5 fantasy points. But everyone got kind of caught up in those 14 touches in week 10. And then we saw Javonte, who had 1 touch, 2 targets in week 10, get 9 touches, 5 targets in week 11. And I will say that I think that this trend of kind of going back and forth is going to continue. We also saw Jaleel McLaughlin get 4 touches compared to 2 touches in week 10. So I don't exactly know what to expect out of the Broncos on a weekly basis at the running back position, and I would definitely proceed with caution if you own Audric Estime or Javonte Williams. But I think they're both startable because this is a good matchup against the Raiders. I will say there's going to be volatility in this backfield, especially with the success of this offense right now and this team kind of getting closer to potentially securing a wild card spot in the playoffs. I think that they're going to try and stay fresh here and move around a bit with what they're doing at the running back position. So I know Javonte had the great week 11, 18.7 fantasy points, 59 yards on the ground, a tutty, 4 catches for 28 receiving yards, out-touched Audric Estime. But it could switch a little bit this week. I think for me, it's a situation that I'm trying to avoid. But these guys are both startable against the Raiders. If you're desperate, just don't get your hopes up. It could kind of go either way here. Now, looking at the Raiders' backfield, we saw an injury to Alexander Madison, who was struggling against the Dolphins. Then we saw an injury to Zamir White, who was also struggling against the Dolphins' defense. So they might both be out this week. If they are, that's going to leave Amir Abdullah as the next man up, who had 10.7 fantasy points because he caught a receiving touchdown in week 11. It's a tough matchup here against a good Denver Broncos run defense, so I'm trying to stay away from this situation. We might see Madison play. We might see White play. We might see one or the other. We might see none of them. So I just don't like anything about this situation. If you're absolutely desperate, pay attention as the week progresses. Maybe you can pick up Amir Abdullah as a spot play if you're desperate for points, but I just don't want anything to do with this situation. It's not a good matchup. It's not a very productive backfield as is, so I'm avoiding all Raiders running backs going into week 12. Next up, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Seahawks. The Cardinals on bye week in week 11. So the last time we saw James Conner was in week 10 against the Jets. He had a great fantasy outing, 22.3 fantasy points, 12 touches on the ground, 33 rushing yards, a touchdown, 5 catches for 80 receiving yards. Good matchup this week against the Seattle Seahawks. Keep rolling with James Conner, the RB14 so far on the season. There's just no reason whatsoever to bench James Conner, Amari DeMarcado, Trey Benson, the next man up here. Benson had a solid week 10 as well, 10.7 fantasy points, 62 yards on the ground, 2 catches for 25 receiving yards. But he got a little bit more involvement as kind of closing out that game as the Cardinals were kind of beating up on the Jets there. So he's a good handcuff, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to call him startable quite yet. Now, James Conner, a strong start this week. If you own him, you're definitely rolling with him. On the other hand, we got Kenneth Walker for the Seattle Seahawks, who also continues to be a solid start on a week-in, week-out basis. The RB18 so far on the season, 13.9 fantasy points in week 11 in that win over the Niners, 54 yards on the ground, a tutty, 2 catches for 5 receiving yards. Listen, the upside hasn't been as high for Walker lately. The last time we've seen him score over 20 fantasy points was week 7 of the season. But the double-digit fantasy performances are there. He's only scored under 10 fantasy points, actually under 13.7 fantasy points so far on the season once in week 8 against Buffalo, and that kind of blowout that Buffalo had against the Seahawks. So keep rolling with Walker. This Cardinals defense, nothing to sneeze at. I will add, they look pretty good right now, but Walker, a strong start. Zach Charbonnet, he's just a handcuff. Nothing but a handcuff. Way too hard to call when and if he's going to have standalone value. He's a strong handcuff. We've seen what he can do if Kenneth Walker is out. We saw that early in the season, but we are not starting Zach Charbonnet here in week 12. We got 2 studs in this matchup. Conner, Walker, fire them up here in week 12. Next up, we have the Niners traveling to face the Packers. The Niners coming off of a tough loss, and the Packers coming off of a tough win that probably maybe should have been a loss. Nonetheless, Christian McCaffrey, 14.6 fantasy points in his second game on the season. 79 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 4 catches, 27 receiving yards. We're missing that touchdown upside out of CMC thus far on the season, but this is still Christian McCaffrey's backfield without a doubt, and this is still Christian McCaffrey, and he's still giving you 2 double-digit fantasy performances, so continue to roll with him. I don't think we need to break that down too much. Jordan Mason, just 2 touches in week 11. That improved from week 10 where he had 1 touch. Isaac Garando, 0 touches in week 11. No reason to touch either of these players. This is C-Mac's backfield. He's a strong start this week. Josh Jacobs, on the other hand, also a strong start. One of my top buy low options before the trade deadline hit. And he had 23.4 fantasy points, 76 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 5 targets, 4 catches, 58 receiving yards. No reason to bench him this week. It's not the greatest matchup. I'm not concerned about it. He's going to get the volume. He's the RB12 on the season. He's been super solid. He's only given you single digits once on the season in week 3 when Malik Willis was taking some of those rushing touchdowns away. And don't forget, Josh Jacobs, if you're a Josh Jacobs owner, fantastic playoff stretch. Week 15 and 16, Seattle and New Orleans. Then a good competitive game script and a tough matchup, I will admit, in week 17 against the Vikings. But that game could have huge playoff implications. So if you're a Josh Jacobs owner right now, you should be feeling very good. He's going to be a start for the rest of the season. If you're a Christian McCaffrey owner, you should also feel pretty good right now, as the Niners are going to be scraping out as many wins as they can possibly get to wrap up this season, especially after that loss this past week. So C-Mac, Jacobs, start them. Everyone else here going to be a sit in week 12. Next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Rams. So this is going to be a very straightforward evaluation. Let's start with the Eagles, which is just Saquon Barkley. Barkley's a start no matter what. I feel like reminding you guys that 2 of the running backs I talked the most about in the offseason as my top targets going into the season were Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. Just got to toot my horn for a minute there, but 33.8 fantasy points in week 11 out of Barkley, 26 touches, 146 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions off of 3 targets, 52 receiving yards. The Rams' run defense, or front 7, has been better as of late. It doesn't matter. You were starting Saquon Barkley, and we could get a nice little competitive game script here in week 12. Start Barkley no matter what. Gainwell, 4 touches, 1 target this past week. Shipley, 0 offensive snaps. No reason to even consider either of these guys outside of potential handcuff territory. But even then, I don't even know if they're worth a roster spot. This is Barkley's backfield until further notice. Kyren Williams, on the other hand, continues to be a strong start. I mean, I know he had the bad week in week 11, and this is a tough matchup, but he's still at 86 yards on the ground, 5.73 yards per carry in week 11. Was actually his best yards per carry mark thus far on the season. I know we've been missing that touchdown upside for Kyren Williams, as he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 8 against Minnesota, but even in a tough matchup here, if I own Kyren Williams, this is your RB6 so far on the season. I would continue to fire up Kyren Williams with confidence. We did see a little bit more action out of Blake Corum this past week. He had 5 touches, 1 target, 1 catch, but he's still a handcuff. Nothing to read into there. And Ronnie Rivers, not a player that we're going to be considering whatsoever. He hasn't had a touch since week 4. So once again, 2 studs here, Barkley, Williams. Fire them up with confidence in a good game script here in week 12. Last but not least, on Monday Night Football, to wrap up the week, we've got the Ravens traveling to face the Chargers. And this is another pretty easy one, but let's start with the Ravens side of things. Derrick Henry has a touchdown in every game on the season. He has a rushing touchdown in every game on the season except for 1. He has been fantastic. He's your RB1 on the season. I know it was a lower ceiling in week 11, 10.5 fantasy points, 65 yards on the ground, no work in the receiving game, 1 touchdown on the ground, but even in a tough matchup against the Chargers this week, I don't see any reason whatsoever to bench Derrick Henry, and I don't think I really need to break that down any further. To give you a little bit more confidence, even coming off of last week, and with the tough matchup, Chase Brown on average still had over 19 fantasy points in week 11, so have confidence in Henry. He'll be fine. Justice Hill, on the other hand, did have 8.1 fantasy points in week 11. He's always one of these guys you can throw in if you're really desperate, maybe in deeper formats, and try and guess when he is going to get you some points. But I'm not going to try and do that or try and have you guys do that. So I got him as a sit, but the potential for 7, 8, 10 points is there, but it's just way too hard to call. Pete Mitchell, on the other hand, just no production whatsoever as he's slowly being eased into this offense. Hasn't seen any touches since he's returned from injury, so he is not going to be a start. Now, J.K. Dobbins, for all the J.K. Dobbins warriors, no reason to worry. 18.9 fantasy points in week 11, 11 touches, 56 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, a catch for 3 receiving yards. Now, maybe there is a slight reason to still worry because to start the game, we saw a lot of Gus Edwards. Then towards the goal line, we saw Hassan Haskins come in. And then it was like J.K. Dobbins was the one to score the touchdown. And the Chargers were like, all right, let's just hand it off to J.K. Dobbins the rest of the game. I obviously scored the touchdown to kind of finish things off, or almost finish things off there at the end of the game as well. So, I mean, Dobbins is the best back from a fantasy perspective in this backfield. And going into week 11, I still like them enough to call him a start. And I know week 10 was a little bit worrisome. And as the season progresses, as the Chargers continue to move into playoff territory, we will see times where they're trying to keep J.K. Dobbins fresh and they're utilizing Edwards, they're utilizing Haskins. But I don't think it's going to be enough of a concern that we're going to have to consider benching J.K. Dobbins. So continue to roll with him. He's given you double digits every game except for 2 since week 6. He's a good start this week, even in a tough matchup. But he's going to have some tough matchups over the next couple of weeks. The Ravens, the Falcons, and the Chiefs. But what we can expect is good, competitive game scripts out of these matchups for the Chargers. So I would continue to start J.K. Dobbins as he's a vital part of that Chargers offense as we roll into week 12. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single running back, and who you should be starting or sitting as we get into week 12. As always, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 12, be sure to drop me a comment and I'll answer every comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because as the week progresses, we are going to have everything you could possibly need to help you dominate week 12 of fantasy football. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, it's out here on the catch.